Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a live edition of the LSU Sports Insider Podcast. I'm Zach Ewing. With me, advocate, LSU football beat writer Wilson Alexander. And the Tigers got it done again over the weekend. They continue to kind of ace this offseason, and it ended with one more transfer portal commitment, which Wilson has learned will be the Tigers' last transfer portal commitment, but it was a big one, Wilson.
That's right. Houston transfer safety AJ Haulcy, who had visited Miami earlier last week, but as the week continued and he kept his options open, a lot of momentum built toward LSU. Planned that visit to LSU yesterday, Sunday, and then while he was on the trip, LSU locked up his commitment. He'll be, signing probably here in the next couple of days. And LSU now has 18 players in this transfer class, the most in 1 year under Brian Kelly. The number one transfer class in the country. It had been passed up by Texas Tech at one point this spring, but then after signing Haulcy and Bernard Gooden from USF, a defensive lineman who we'll talk about more later, back to that number one spot in the 24/7 sports rankings. This is a class that has transformed this roster and what to expect from this team going into 2025. And Haulcy and Gooden, these two additions in the spring, are both guys that LSU, I think, is going to count on to play some role this year.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have brought him in. That's probably pretty obvious, but we'll get more into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think
it's not like they're just bringing in depth pieces, is what I mean, I guess.
Right, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I think when folks see the first two deep this fall, it's going to be kind of eye-opening how many of these transfers are on there, and we'll talk about that. I also think, and maybe we should mention this now, we're going to have, this is kind of a two-part podcast. We'll have another one later in the week. We're thinking Thursday, but it could possibly be earlier than that, that kind of explains how LSU put all this together. Like just talking about Haulcy, I'm always impressed when you can pull a kid away from a Miami trip. What?
Yeah, he was getting hit a time that he was spending with Rick Ross and a police escort in Miami.
How can you beat that?
Well, I think there was a couple of things. Talking to Haulcy's agents last week, they said three things that he wanted in his next school. One was to play in the SEC, which, well, LSU checks that box over Miami. Mm-hmm. He wanted to compete for a championship. That was another big thing. And he wanted to improve his draft stock. Now, the championship and the draft stock, you can probably argue you could do at both schools. The SEC is something that obviously only LSU has. It's also LSU is closer to his hometown of Houston. Not only did he play at Houston, that's where he's from. He started his career at New Mexico and then transferred closer to home. And now, that's within driving distance, Houston to Baton Rouge. I think that helps. And I was told that, while we don't have the exact numbers, that LSU's offer was competitive with everybody else. I think coming out of the transfer portal, from what I understand, or entering the transfer portal, he had an expectation of a number that no one really met. LSU, according to sources on staff, they had a number, they stood firm at that number, and they were able to get him in a range that felt comfortable for them and what they wanted to be able to spend. And so everything really worked out for them here to be able to add a safety who has a ton of experience, which is something that's really a positive thing for LSU secondary, and has made a ton of tackles over the course of his career, which is also something that they needed.
Yeah. So just to reiterate, later in the week, we will have the second part of this, which is kind of the big picture. How did LSU put all this together? Obviously, NIL helps. I mean, when I said you could think of a few reasons why he would choose LSU, well, people could probably think of a few 100,000 reasons why he would choose LSU. But from a larger perspective, they've landed 18 transfers. Almost all of these guys are high quality. They beat out Power 4 competition for them. So you have to budget. I mean, there's not unlimited funds. You have to budget that out. And some of these guys undoubtedly were getting equal or maybe even better offers from other places. So it can't just be about the NIL budget, but you're putting a big story together on that this week. And when it comes out, we're also going to have the podcast with it. So looking forward to that one. Subscribe to the LSU Tigers at NOLA.com YouTube channel for notifications when we'll have that one up. But this one's going to be more focused on where Haulcy fits and just kind of on the field where this transfer class can make the most impact. And as you mentioned, Haulcy, a tackling machine. He was 74 tackles last year. He had 5 interceptions, part of 13 passes defended, first team all Big 12. I mean, he's a guy who gets himself around the ball and makes plays.
He really does. I mean, that's the thing that kind of stood out to me, just looking at the numbers before we kind of dive more into maybe some of the film stuff. And I mean, it shows up on film too, but just the tackling. I mean, 259 career tackles. He has played a lot of football over the past 3 years. He started 24 straight games at Houston. He started 9 games as a freshman at New Mexico. A guy who was not a highly rated recruit coming out of high school, starting right away and then playing a ton of football for 3 years. And I think it's significant, the tackling piece, because LSU has struggled to tackle and to have proper angles to the ball and to fit the run coming from the safety position over the past, I think, really 2 years in particular. 2022 was all right in that regard, but the last 2 years, LSU struggled in those areas. And I feel like Haulcy right away can kind of make a difference there. You see some highlights on tape. There's actually, when he was at New Mexico in 2022, he played LSU in Tiger Stadium. And there's some clips of him tackling Jaden Daniels. Which is, not nothing. And so,
yeah.
And also, I think he plays with some physicality. He's 6 foot 215, a big body back there at safety. So, we saw there's hit plays of him where he's physical. He's bringing, a lot of force to the, guy trying to catch a pass. There's still some things that he probably needs to clean up. It's not like he's a perfect, this guy's going to be a first round drafty type of prospect. There was a few plays in the Oklahoma tape where he kind of got sucked in trying to defend the run, and some play actions got hit over his head on RPOs. But for the most part, I feel like this is somebody who raises the floor of LSU's safety room this season.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And like you said, a cool story from a guy who's, got a Division I offer out of high school. He's not a nobody, but he certainly was not a highly ranked recruit. And for him to kind of make his way up the food chain from New Mexico, which is, usually toward the bottom of the Mountain West Conference, to Houston, which is now in the Big 12 and now playing in the SEC and probably going to get some significant playing time for this team. So you mentioned the film part of it. I mean, is there anything else you want to hit on Haulcy specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a coverage standpoint, because you're going to have to do that as a safety. It's not like you can just be a run defender. He was pretty good in that regard in the last year in particular. I mean, he caught 5 interceptions. That was tied for the most in the Big 12. Showed some good hands. It's interesting. LSU wants to be a defense that plays a lot of man coverage in the back end. And that we think of that most, I think, as it applies to your corners. But at safety, you're going to have to play some man too. I think maybe it's a little bit of a question mark. It seemed like Houston played a good bit of zone coverage. So we're going to have to kind of see just sort of how he does in that regard, because obviously a lot of his snaps are in zone. But also, I mean, it's not like he's going to be playing man exclusively at LSU. So I'm interested to see kind of how he does in man coverage in the SEC, going up against the quality of tight ends and receivers and running backs that he'll have to cover. But otherwise, I mean, I just feel like he's got what it takes to be able to do that for the most part, and he showed good instincts, which was really key. Like I said, there was moments when he got kind of caught looking into the backfield or trying to come up and stop the run. But as a coverage safety, I think that he'll probably be good enough, and he just does some things there in that sort of as the tackler in particular. I just keep coming back to that. I feel like last year he didn't have as many tackles as he had the previous 2 seasons. He had 98 tackles in 2023, which is absurd from the safety position. But anyway, I still feel like that's the strength of his game and something that is going to help this LSU team.
Yeah, and obviously that's an area where they need help. So let's kind of wrap things up real quick on what they brought in. And this is just, you mentioned it, the rankings are now have flipped back. LSU's past Texas Tech. They're number 1 in the portal again. And it had to do with these 2 spring portal additions, both Haulcy and then another, I mean, really high quality transfer we haven't talked about on the show is Bernard Gooden, a defensive tackle from South Florida. And he brings like all conference credentials with him as well. So 2 kind of areas where Wilson, I think you and I had question marks after the first portal season is that these are still 2 areas they could shore up. And that's exactly what they've done.
It is, and Gooden is somebody, he's a top 100 transfer prospect on 24/7 sports rankings, kind of in that 50-ish range, if I'm remembering correctly. And he's someone who's 6 foot, or I think it was 6 foot, and hang on, let me find exactly his measurables when he was at USF last year, what they had him listed at. 6'1", 280. Excuse me. I was starting to get him. As I said 6 foot, I was starting to get him and AJ Haulcy mixed up because AJ is 6.
You can't short him that inch, man. That's important.
It's important. So 6'1", 280. So a little bit on the smaller side for like a defensive tackle in some respects in the SEC. But somebody who, in terms of the comp that I kept hearing from people at LSU staff, was Mekhi Wingo. Somebody who was really productive for LSU, mostly as a kind of a 3-tech defensive tackle. That's something that LSU needs in this scheme with Blake Baker. It's not like you're asking him to play nose. He's going to play 3-tech. And he is someone who LSU coaches see as being really twitchy and explosive, having a nice get off. That was something that Mekhi Wingo had too. So kind of similar size, maybe some similar qualities to their game. LSU, in terms of the defensive front, wants to create havoc. Blake Baker talks about that a lot. He talks about the defensive tackle specifically being the tip of the spear. And by that, he means those guys got to get upfield and start to create disruption in the backfield. And they think that Bernard Gooden can do that. And when you look at sort of what LSU has in the defensive tackle room now, Bernard Gooden is one of the more experienced players there. He had a lot of snaps last year at USF. LSU is really young at both sort of nose guard and those 3-tech spots. And I think that he can kind of come in, him and Ahmad Bro and Dominic McKinley can kind of give you a nice group at that 3-tech. And then you're not putting so much on 2 guys who are going to be second-year players and asking them to take huge leaps. It kind of alleviates some of the pressure on them, which is a good thing.
Yeah, no doubt. And I just, again, this may kind of fall into Thursday's discussion also, or the second part of this podcast, whenever that is. But I just find it emblematic of LSU's approach to this portal season, where, like I said, a month ago, we're going, they could still probably use one more safety and one more defensive tackle. And they just went out and got it. They've been so aggressive going after the top guys, going after areas of need. And I don't know if that attitude really shows what they're thinking about this coming season, because they're going to try to win every season. But it just seems like, especially LSU's kind of out for blood this portal season.
Yeah, they are in a way that they have not been the past 3 years. I think Austin Thomas coming over as the GM, coming back to LSU for the 3rd time, having been at Ole Miss for the previous 2 years, I think he's a part of that. And then it's also, part of it is that they have 3 straight seasons of at least 3 losses. And now you're heading into year 4 of the Brian Kelly era. You got to win. You also need to take advantage of the fact that you've got a second-year quarterback who could be a first-round pick. And you got to build around him in Garrett Nussmeier. I think those are elements that are going on with it. And some of it, as we talked about, is having the NIL to be able to go after these guys, knowing that you're also in this moment between NIL era and the start of the revenue sharing era, where you've got more money to spend, and LSU thinks that it did a really good job of preparing for those 2 things and being able to front load a lot of NIL deals. This is kind of a preview almost of kind of what we're going to talk about next week, but they were able to be aggressive, and they wanted to be aggressive in the transfer portal. And as one of the things that Brian Kelly told me earlier this spring was, they weren't just going to take a flyer on a guy from Cornell. Like, that wasn't like what they could do in this portal class. Whereas in years past, we saw them take some players who really didn't contribute. There's pretty much everybody who LSU took, these 18, are going to probably have some role on the team. Michael Van Buren comes to mind as okay, he might not play very much this year because he's the backup quarterback, but that's still in a really important spot. Is Donovan Green your 3rd tight end? How much is he going to play? Well, he still needed some depth. A lot of these guys, though, aren't just depth pieces. They're on your 2 deep in rotations, a lot of them starting. And that's a change from what we've seen LSU do in the transfer portal, particularly compared to last year when they only signed, I think it was 9 transfers. They had the 43rd ranked class in the country. And this is a complete change. You've doubled the number of transfers. You got the number 1 class. And that is a huge shift from what we had seen this team try to do. And Brian Kelly will tell you that, some of that was an intentional last year, and kind of, they didn't have the program and the foundation that it needed yet. And no, they had to wait to be able to do it this year. I'm not totally sure I buy that personally, frankly, because I think, to your point, you want to win every year. And I think they just missed on some guys last year. They didn't have as much money as they needed to go after the top prospects, but they did this year. And they were aggressive and they hit on it. And now we'll see how everything starts to translate for this team, whether or not it actually can pay off in a college football playoff run, because that is now the expectation.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think it's important to remember too, as an LSU fan, people should be happy that, hey, the portal season didn't work quite last season. They're trying something different. They're doing it a different way. And it's obvious to say they should be happy. It's the number 1 ranked class, duh. But it's not just the fact that they brought in talent, is that they're being so specific in what they're seeking out, I think. And we'll take a break here in a minute, but we're going to talk about exactly where these things fit and where they got the most improved.
Oh, you want to take the break now or wait until we
We
come
can
back?
we'll take our quick 30 now, and we'll be back, and we'll launch into that after this.
There's no better place to parlay than Caesars Sportsbook. With quick picks, you can tap right into pre-built ready-to-bet parlays right from the home screen. And if you miss tip-off, no worries. You can play same-game parlays live during the action. Plus, it's never been easier to find and bet on the biggest matchups of the day, so you can keep up with all the action. Caesars Sportsbook, proud partner of the NBA and the only sportsbook app with Caesars Rewards. Download it today.
Okay, back on the LSU Sports Insider podcast, talking about these last two transfers LSU got to complete this set of 18 that they bring in the offseason. It is the number one ranked transfer class by 24/7 Sports in the nation, repassing Texas Tech for number one. And I mean, this is a hard question to answer, Wilson, but where did LSU improve the most? Where were you the most kind of had your eyes opened by what LSU was able to do?
Can I say the entire defense, or is that too broad?
I think LSU fans would be happy to hear you say that.
Yeah. So last year, LSU obviously revamped the entire coaching staff on defense, bringing in completely new coaches at every single spot. But the personnel largely stayed the same. And it was always like, okay, well, how much can this staff get out of this group, which seems to have kind of a lower ceiling, maybe a little bit of a lower floor. I think they were able to do a lot, but it was always clear that LSU needed to go and add talent on the entire defense. And they did that here. I mean, you've got 3 edge rushers who are going to play significant snaps for you. You've got potentially new starters at all 4 spots in the secondary. We'll talk. I think we should talk a little bit more in a second about sort of how LSU can maneuver these pieces around in the secondary. It's going to be really interesting because some of these guys have some versatility. You didn't have to do anything at linebacker, and so they didn't. But you've also added a little bit of depth at your defensive tackle spots. And I mean, when you think about it now, the only guys who are like returning players who I think are guaranteed to start on LSU's defense as a whole, I'm kind of thinking about it as I say it, is Harold Perkins and Whit Weeks, and that might be it. Like, I would also say at defensive tackle, I mean, probably like Jacobian Guillory, depending on how his Achilles is going. And like Ahmad Bro and Dominic McKinley, like they're going to play a lot, those 3 for sure. But there's really every other spot like could end up being a transfer or even a new player. Like if DJ Pickett as a freshman can come in and start at corner. Now there's some other returning players who are going to have something to say about that in fall camp. But that's kind of what you're talking about with this defense is the personnel on defense has been completely overturned for Blake Baker now going into his second year. It feels like the potential for this defense is a lot higher than it would have been otherwise.
Yeah, I think we talked about this a month or so ago. Like, if Ashton Stamps becomes a backup, that's good for LSU. It's not good for Ashton Stamps, but like that's really quality depth during a season when you're going to have injuries, you're going to have somebody have a bad day, and you need somebody else to come in. I mean, like that's what LSU's defense has missed so much, in my opinion. Is just the drop off from starters to backups, and from one game to the next, the consistency hasn't been there at every spot. But I do think the secondary is probably a really good place to zero in here, because as you said, we don't even know how these guys are going to line up. Whether it's Pickett and Delane on the outside, whether Stamps gets in there, the new safeties. I mean, like there's so much versatility here. All we know for sure is that the talent level has risen. The floor and the ceiling should rise on this secondary.
Absolutely. I feel like, as we already mentioned, LSU wants to be able to play a lot of man coverage. Blake Baker said this spring that he thinks they're getting closer to being able to do that, to be able to play press man. And that's kind of fits his defensive style, to be able to really let things go on the front end, create that havoc, and then just live on islands and stick to your guys in the back end is kind of how he wants to be able to play defensive football in an ideal world. Although, you can't just do that every single play, of course. But in that secondary now, you've got someone in Mansour Delane who has some versatility. I mean, LSU could end up playing him at nickel, or maybe even move him to safety, although I don't think it's necessary for him to play safety now with what you have in that room. We'll see how it shakes out, but it seems like, okay, you've got enough people there and that he can play more of his natural spots. You don't have to maybe put him out of position. So he can play on the outside of corner like he has been in the spring. He could also play some inside in their dime and their nickel packages. On the other side, there's so many guys in the mix with, DJ Pickett, Jakeem Jackson, the transfer from Florida, Stamps, who we already mentioned. Even PJ Woodland and Michael Turner might have something to say about getting into the rotation in some respect. Although they're, younger players and it might be tough to pass over some guys with the experience. But then at safety, it's really interesting now with Haulcy, okay, you could end up having safety just like him and Tamarcus Cooley at deep safety, but also Tamarcus Cooley really played nickel at NC State. He wasn't a deep safety. And asking LSU coaches about that in the spring when we get the chance to talk to Blake Baker or Brian Kelly, they didn't seem to think that was, I remember Brian Kelly specifically saying at one point, like, that's not a concern. They're really similar. Like, he can just drop back to deep safety and, like, it's not going to be, like, much of a transition for him. But now you have the option to put him more as your nickel, or maybe you can even move somebody else to play nickel in certain packages and have him at safety. I feel like there's a little bit of added versatility in this group. It also means that now LSU has all of its practices in August to figure out how to do that, because you got to have it in place right away against Clemson. You can't be like trying to still figure out where everybody fits properly. But they have a good, I think, idea of all that, having gone through the spring with most of this secondary. Now you just put AJ Haulcy in the mix there too, and you're able to sort of move things around. And it's like, okay, you've got AJ Haulcy, you've got Jordan Gilbert coming back off of a shoulder injury. Is he going to be better now that he's recovered from those things that were kind of nagging him during last season? You've got some young players in Deshaun Spears, who, and even Cooley to an extent, who, are going to be part of this. Javian Toviano could be an option there. You've got a lot of options at safety that's going to be fascinating to see what they do with them, because there's some versatility in that secondary to be able to move guys around if you want to.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible the different permutations there could be of how this all fits together, and I think it's important to make those skill sets mesh back there. Like if you have one safety, like a Haulcy who's a strong run defender, do you want the other guy to be more of a center fielder? Like you want those skill sets to match, and they have the versatility to do that. The other thing I'll say, Wilson, and this obviously helps the secondary, I think the pass rush has a chance to be much improved. Between Jack Pyburn from Florida, Patrick Payton from Florida State, the edge rushers, I don't know, you get pressure on the quarterback, and that makes the secondary's job easier too.
It would. It's interesting though. I mean, you're in that group of edge rushers, you've got guys who with a lot of experience with those two, Jamari Butler. You even got Gabe Relaford coming on as a sophomore, who, when LSU was bringing all these transfers, he said that the thing that crossed his mind was, damn, are they trying to replace me? And he talked to the coaches, and they said, well, look, I mean, competition is going to make you better. And he's responded well to that. But yeah, I think it gives LSU an edge room with potential. And now they've got to live up to that. A guy like Patrick Payton 2 years ago at Florida State was fantastic. And then last year he took a step back. So can he take a step forward? It's like, it's not just really across the defense. I think you kind of run into this anytime you bring in transfers for the most part. Like, you're going to have some questions about how they translate to your team, to now a new conference in some cases, and all those sorts of things. But there is a lot of potential in this group to be disruptive off the edge. I mean, Pyburn, we know, is a really good run defender. He's violent at the point of attack. Him and Relaford, I think, help you in terms of setting the edge in particular. Peyton probably has the highest ceiling as a pass rusher in those group, but you also have to factor into your pass rush the fact that you'll have Harold Perkins back. And if Blake Baker is actually really able to use him in that way, third down in particular, then I think you're really starting to talk about an effective pass rush there, because you have a lot of different options. Blake can get creative with his blitzes, which we saw last year. You remember those? I think it was against Arkansas in particular, where we had everybody line up in like an eye down the middle of the field, like off the center, and then they sort of disperse this way. I mean, like, he can do different things. We know that Blake likes to, so he'll have options to do that. But I'm curious to see just if this edge rusher room can kind of meet that potential, because it's going to be key for LSU that they do.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, and you're right. Like, Blake Baker, you give him some toys, he's going to find ways to use them. Like, that's what he relishes, and we'll see some of that. Like, am I watching an arena ball game, or is this serious? Like, are they? And sometimes it works. So on the offensive side of the ball, Wilson, you mentioned Michael Van Buren. I do think that's an underrated addition, because if something should happen to Garrett Nussmeier, even if it's just, like the Oklahoma game last year where he has to leave for a couple of drives, or obviously worst case scenario, he missed more time than that. You've got a guy who's been in the SEC fire before. And no, he wasn't overly successful at Mississippi State, but in that situation, you have a backup quarterback, just go in there and don't mess things up. Right. And he can do that with maybe some playmaking ability.
And he can also maybe be your quarterback in 2026 and beyond. We'll see how he develops over the course of the year. And, at the end of this season, if LSU thinks he's ready for that. But watching him in the spring, it just seemed like LSU got better at backup quarterback than it was a year ago. Michael Van Buren has more experience in the SEC than anybody who else you had on its roster last year. AJ Swan had started at Vanderbilt, but Van Buren, I think, played more games as a freshman and started more games. And he showed some really good things. I mean, he showed some accuracy as a deep ball passer, an ability to reach multiple levels of the field with his arm, a little bit of athleticism. He's not like a huge runner, but I think he rushed for 5 touchdowns. He is got a little bit of arm talent that I think you can work with. And, as LSU continues to look, we talked about this before, the Bryce Underwood decommitment didn't really affect you for as much for 2025 as it did for 2026. So now you go and you get Michael Van Buren and you see over the course of this year if you think he could be ready for that. And if not, then you go into the transfer portal again next year, maybe for a quarterback. But in the meantime, you've got somebody who I think you feel comfortable with if you have to put him in if something were to happen to Garrett Nussmeier. Garrett Nussmeier is a step above, but Van Buren has some experience and he's got some arm talent that you can work with for sure.
Yeah, but I do think when you talk offense, wide receiver, offensive line, those are the two spots where and I don't know.
And tight end.
Yeah, in tight end. And I don't know if the receivers are going to crack starting rotation, but they're going to see some playing time. Oh. But in the O line, they certainly will.
I think at least Barry and Brown will. Nick Anderson too. I think it's going to be interesting. Yeah, who starts and who's a rotational player on that receiver room, because you've got 5 guys who can probably start for you in some respect with Nick Anderson, Barry and Brown, Chris Hilton, Aaron Anderson, and Xavion Thomas. And that's probably the front 5 out, and LSU will kind of mix them and match them different ways. Coming out of the spring, it was clear that Nick Anderson was kind of dealing with something for most of the spring. Brian Kelly confirmed that he'd had an injury. And so we don't really have a great idea of how he fits into this receiver rotation yet. We won't until August. But in terms of the talent and the pass catching potential there, it's really high. He also sort of brings a physical makeup at 6'4" that LSU doesn't have anywhere else in that room. And so, they're all going to be contributors. It's just a matter of getting on the same page with Garrett Nussmeier. That's going to be the key throughout the offseason. We didn't really see it in the spring that they were clicking on all cylinders in the passing game. So they've got to be able to continue to work throughout the offseason on that as these new faces. Because like Garrett said, him and Chris Hilton came in together. When he's throwing to him, he pretty much knows where Chris is going to be. He's got to find that chemistry and that timing with these new players. But yeah, on the offensive line, you've got Josh Thompson and Braylon Moore. And though they didn't cement themselves as starters in the spring, the expectation is still that they are going to, at some point, really push for that and probably unseat somebody. And Brian Kelly has already said that Weston Davis is probably going to start at right tackle, and it looks like Tyree Adams is probably going to start at left tackle. What will be most fascinating here in August, once we get to preseason camp, is who plays center, who plays guard. Because Braylon Moore and Josh Thompson, that's where you would probably put them. But if DJ Chester is going to have something to say about that, Paul Mabinga might have something to say about that, Cohen Eccles is going to be in the mix too. So LSU's got some options there, and they got to figure it out pretty quickly so that offensive line can start to mesh. One other thing just to add, if Weston Davis doesn't work out as right tackle, then Josh Thompson has the versatility to move over there if LSU needs him to.
Yeah, we're seeing some consistent refrains in this podcast. The competition means that the talent levels up, and if the incumbent wins that job, then that means he improved most likely. If not, then that means LSU improved at that spot. So either way, that's a good thing. We're also hearing versatility. Anywhere else you want to wrap this up, Wilson, as far as where these transfers fit on this team? And then obviously later in the week, we'll have a much larger picture discussion about how this all went down.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't mention it tight end. Bauer Sharp is going to be a big piece of this team. You have to mention him when you talk about the transfers who were most impressive in the spring. He looks smooth as a route runner, fluid as a pass catcher, athletic. There was a highlight that LSU released of him hurdling somebody. nice to see that from your tight end. And so him and Trey'Dez Green create a pretty good combination there. It's going to be fascinating to see what LSU can do with that position, how much it uses 12 personnel, which is something they've talked about a lot over the years, but haven't really implemented to the degree that you would think to the amount that it's been talked about. So those two are interesting. I mean, gosh, we fit on every position really. Oh, well, punter. They added a punter who might help them in that regard too. And Grant Chadwick. I guess the thing to end on would just be sort of the broad look at this transfer class has transformed the outlook of what this team could be. Brian Kelly told me earlier this spring that LSU now has a team that's poised to compete with anybody in the SEC, and they didn't before. He thinks that they are capable, if they do all the right things on the field, to win the SEC, which would get you most likely first round bye in the college football playoff and put you firmly in the mix of championship contention, which is not something that this team has done since 2019. They've been on the fringes of that throughout the Brian Kelly era. Obviously, they went to the SEC title game in his first season, but you lost pretty big to Georgia in that game. And you never – I mean, obviously, it's a little bit different when you had a 4-team playoff for the first 2 years of his tenure. But even then, you would have been on kind of the edges fighting for some of those last spots, and especially in like Jaden Daniels' Heisman season. And so, and then last year you weren't really that close to sniffing it at 8-4. And so they've got to be able to get closer to that. The expectation now, I think, from a lot of people is to make the playoff and then see what happens from there. But if LSU doesn't, then the calls for Brian Kelly and his job are going to get really loud from the fan base. And there's going to be a ton of pressure going into 2026 to try to get back to that. You've set yourself up to make a run with adding all of these transfers, the experience that they have, the number of snaps that they have played, and the talent level that you now have on the roster is higher. I think the depth has improved, which is hard to do during the transfer portal era. That's usually what coaches will tell you, is that your depth gets affected the most. And we've seen that over the past years at LSU. Now it seems like your depth is better, but now you got to go and you've got to really prove it on the field that all of this was worth it and all this is going to make a true difference, because LSU now is getting a little bit impatient. Not LSU is like people in the administration. I don't want to speak for them, but like the fan base, I think is getting a little bit impatient. Like, all right, you better now you've gone and done all this. Now you better prove it on the field that it was worth it and that this team can actually make a run and what will be a competitive league this year. Yeah.
I mean, and that's a perfect transition, I think, into our next podcast for the week, is just how aggressive LSU was, how they pulled that off. Because now, to your point, Brian Kelly's, he's coming out and saying we've got what we need. So if you've got what you need, you better get the job done. That's going to be the message from the fans and the donors and the people who are contributing to all of this. So that's the bottom line. And we'll dig more into that on Thursday. But for now, as we just look on the field, transfers are volatile. We know that. You just never quite know what you're getting in individual players, but it's hard to give this transfer class anything but like an A+, right? Just on paper and what they brought in and where they brought it in.
LSU addressed every single need that it had. And to your point, you don't exactly know. It's almost like a recruiting class when it signs and it comes out of high school. You don't really know for 2 to 3 years if that class is going to live up to its ranking. And we won't know until the season actually starts if that number one ranking is going to matter. We've talked about this in the past. Ole Miss has signed top transfer portal classes, and yet it has not made the playoff. And last year it invested a lot into that team financially, and it still went 9-3 and missed the playoff. And the LSU is going to have to make sure that it is, Florida State been really portal heavy and had obviously last year had a huge fall off. So it's tough to bring in a ton of new pieces all at once and have everything click. And it's really tough the way LSU's schedule sets up with Clemson, Florida, and Ole Miss in 3 of the first 5 weeks of the season. But I think what you can say now for sure about this team is the talent is there in a way that maybe it wasn't across the board the last 3 years. LSU had a super talented offense in 2023 and was awful on defense. I feel like the talent is higher on both sides of the ball. The depth is improved on both sides of the ball. And you think that you've gotten better on your coaching staff, especially defensively with everything that you did last year. You even brought in Alex Atkins on the offensive side this year, who maybe he can provide sort of a fresh set of eyes for the run game as the running game coordinator. So all this stuff is pointing toward LSU trying to make a push, and now it actually has to go and do it.
Yep. Not all these guys are going to hit, but it's seems like they have enough bites at the apple to where things should be improved. And again, we will be back later this week. We'll talk more about how they did it. Until then, he is LSU football beat writer Wilson Alexander. I am Zach Ewing, and this has been the LSU Sports Insider Podcast. Thank you for watching.